That music brings me a lot of joy. Hearing the voice of Mark Prophet sing that song. Because as Jesus just told us in that teaching, and as Saint Germain is going to tell us in a moment, that it is not enough to wish it. And in that voice, I hear the voice of a man who had no illusions about such things. But it is not enough to wish it. You have to be bold, bring forth your voice, and bring forth your full being to do what must be done. Which is really the theme that we're going to be talking about this morning. But the theme has this funny title: the more I practice, the luckier I get. Now, the first time I heard this, it was, I thought, being attributed to a basketball coach, making some sort of wry remark like, well, basketball is mostly luck. And I find that the more we practice, the luckier we get. When I looked into it, it turns out to be one of those sayings that, has been attributed to many different people over many different times, but very often around sports, around something with which we associate practice and excellence. So on one level, it's just a little joke about how really you make your own luck, right? That you achieve what you work for. But there's a deeper meaning going on in it that's always tickled me a little bit, right? Which is that when you practice enough, everybody can see the skill that you've developed, but something starts to happen at the highest levels that looks like magic or looks like luck. That the seeing of opportunities, the ability to act in the moment, right? To move through a hole that nobody else even knew was there, whatever it is, that it's something beyond, it's something that nobody would ever know how to practice. So there's a deeper truth to this idea that the more we practice, the luckier we get, that applies to all of life. Now, of course, we're really not talking about luck in the sense that, sometimes gets used, which simply kind of indicates a random universe. That's not what we're talking about. The core of today's teaching is that whatever you practice increases its magnetism, and it attracts more like itself. And so this creates something that looks a lot like good luck or bad luck, right? Because what you're practicing is up to you. Unfortunately, this works in both directions. So, one of the things that's, of course, very popular in parts of the spiritual world nowadays is to think in terms of just attracting everything you need, right? That everything comes to you. And of course, there is some truth to this, that we do find that when we are in a state of attunement, when we have the divine source forefront in our minds and we're really practicing it day to day, that a lot of things do come with great ease, right? The problem with this perspective, when it's focused on too much, is that, well, first of all, the point of life is not to get everything you want and need. that there are greater goals for all of us, right? That we want to be of service. We want to be useful to the masters who are trying to lift up the consciousness of the entire world. So there is a greater goal for our attunement. But there's another interesting thing with this perspective that I've shifted around a little bit lately in my mind, whereas instead of thinking of ourselves, our human selves, as standing in the center of the universe, bringing to us everything we need, started to think of this magnetism having a different function. And it's a function that supports us on our journey home. Right? Today we've heard the words of the New Jerusalem, the holy city, Shambhala. That what this life is about is an adventure to that place where we are permanently united. Our soul and our holy Christ self and our higher consciousness are permanently united for eternity, and that we are on a journey to that place. And that what we want to do is we want to practice positive and constructive things to increase this magnetism, because this magnet of our souls and ourselves is an attractor that is being drawn to that holy city, to that destination. And without it, we are liable to take endless detours and to get lost. Okay, but as Kuthumi says in the quote that I put in the newsletter, right, that with positive habit, that as we expand our illumination, the world becomes a highway to Shambhala, like ribbons of glory. I'm not reading it right now, I'm just remembering what I can of it. So we want to be on that highway to Shambhala, being drawn forth with the attraction of our positive magnetism. And along the way, we're going to go on all sorts of adventures, and we're going to meet allies on this journey, and we're going to become stronger on the way. And sure, everything we need is going to be along the way because of where we're headed. So the way that I arrived at this topic was in sort of the aftermath of this of the sermon that I gave last time. So when I was done with the sermon, it turns out it wasn't done with me. And there was because there was a bit we didn't really have time to get to, where Saint Germain really gets in the call to action. Okay, because a lot of the message was very deep and very inspirational and plugged us into a beautiful part of ourselves that could see that alchemy of buoyant and having buoyancy and joy, and how that buoyancy and joy is a seed that leads to the ultimate ability to physically transform ourselves, right? That there is this outer power that comes eventually from this inner buoyancy. But his call to action, he's really saying, okay, so let's get started. It's not enough to wish it. And he talks about having a divine plan for yourself. So these words stuck with me and left that sense of, so how do we do this? And that's how I was guided to this teaching from Kuthumi today. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of Saint Germain's call to action, and then we're going to get right into the teaching of Kuthumi. And we're going to jump in at the point where he's talking about a flight out of the dimension of human bondage into the radiant spheres of cosmic light, which is your home. Now, you are not going to be able to get there, precious ones, by a mere wish to do so. It must be by a cosmic intent that molds and shapes not only the physical form, but all of the nature that is within you. Ladies and gentlemen, you must start somewhere. You have a need to actually sound the sirens. You have a need to actually sound the alarms, because you right now are embodied in physical form in the great cosmic university of Almighty God. In order to graduate from this university, summa cum laude. Okay, so he's saying to sound the alarms, but of course this is not about being alarmed, it's about urgency. And what we want to be are those ones who are very good in an urgent situation. We know that we have to act with immediacy, but we're going to be calm and focused about it. He goes on. You see, most individuals give no thought whatsoever to life, except to plan ahead according to mortal standards. But there is very little actual planning done by individuals according to divine standards. Very few individuals actually plan from day to day how they will be able to draw out the pattern of the cosmic man and mold themselves according to that pattern. No, blessed ones, they are so busy defending the mistakes of a misguided ego that they have no time whatsoever to be able to spiritually plan a blueprint for their own life, which they themselves could design according to God intent. You see, you are a co-creator with God. And when he gave you free will, he also, with that free will, gave you a solemn responsibility of freedom so that you would, of necessity, play a part in the shaping of your own destiny. So this stuff made me say, wow, okay, what does it mean to spiritually plan a blueprint for your life designed according to God's intent? What does it mean to plan from day to day how to mold yourself according to the pattern of the cosmic man? I mean, I think I'm like a lot of us in that, I tend to think in terms of, well, we have our practices, we have our decrees, we have our meditation, we try to cultivate healthy thoughts and emotions and a healthy body, and we say, well, all this will lead there eventually. But in this call, there's a kind of focused action that's being asked for there, that just kind of that question of, okay, what does this really mean? How do you do this? Right? And then again, he's reminding us that we have to engage in shaping our destiny, that it's not optional. There's no generic recipe for the ascension, right? For your individual life stream. There are things that you have to discover for you, and I have to discover for me. So there are these general principles, there are recommendations, there's some things we know, but clearly there are some things we don't, if we're going to design that blueprint according to God's intent. So as I said, with some seeking and being guided, where he ended up with was Kuthumi teaching on habit, which is part of a whole section of the Corona class lessons, these alternating lessons from Jesus and Kuthumi on the subject of habit. And this is from the first of all the chapters, where he's really getting into introducing the subject. So we're going to jump right into it. When the process whereby habits are formed is understood in its entirety, a most useful faculty is forged. In order to understand how habits are formed, it is helpful to observe the cycles of life operational in daily experience. The cycle of the hours as, quote, day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge, unquote, is derived from the diurnal rotation of the earth on its axis, as the hemispheres are alternately exposed to and concealed from the solar radiance. The cycles of the sun, the cycles of the years, occur by reason of the revolution of the earth in its elliptic orbit around the sun. So right out of the gate, Kuthumi is, first of all, quoting Psalm 19, which we started today's service with, but as a way of drawing our attention to the cyclical nature, right, of the world we live in. Exposed to and concealed from solar radiance, right? That both of these things play a function. The cycle of day and night, the cycle of active versus reflective. So right out of the gate, the thing that's being made a great point of is that we're working with energies that are inherently cyclical. Goes on. The cycles of civilization respond to the cosmic tides of stellar influence outplayed in the configurations of the hierarchies of the zodiac, as these interact upon the bodies of the solar system. So many solar systems comprising a galaxy, so many galaxies in procession around the great central sun present a staggering eye view of what, for want of another word, we call the immensity. Yet this is not all. Concentric rings, elongated as ellipses, are the best way of graphically illustrating eternity as distinguished from time and space, which are depicted as a straight line or a geometric angle, segmenting the intersections of the circle of life into separate parts. Okay, so in this introduction to habit, we ran very quickly, right, from day versus night out to the galaxy, and then the many galaxies orbiting around the great central sun, and then the concentric rings versus the straight lines of time and space. So a note first is that I think that linear time and space view that we all sometimes really feel stuck on is useful for some things. We do need to function in the world where that linear perception and being on time for appointments and certain things is important and useful. But for our spiritual evolution, which is really what we're talking about here, there's this progression according to celestial laws, which must be made paramount, right? And in that image of the concentric rings, we have that sense of eternity. It's deep down in us. I mean, and he says, the galaxies in procession around the great central sun present a staggering eye view of what, for want of another word, we call the immensity. So he's taking us to somewhere that the masters call the immensity, and then says, but that's not even all of it. And in those concentric rings, we also always have that view of hierarchy that came out in the invocation before, where we are always somewhere in those rings. And there are rings that are within our level of attainment that contain manifestations of life that we are responsible to share light with and expand their evolution. And that we are always in rings, surrounded by rings that are beyond our level of attainment, where we are being given these great gifts of life. And we are responsible to respond with our respect and our love and our best efforts. Now, we consider, in order to understand that the same law of energy in motion, operative in planetary bodies, governs the orderly process which occurs each time you create a habit in your world. I'm going to read that again because there's also a parenthetical that I didn't read. When he says create a habit, he also says, i.e., set in motion, launch into orbit. So reading it again, this we consider in order to understand that the same law of energy in motion, operative in planetary bodies, governs the orderly process which occurs each time you create, set in motion, launch into orbit a habit in your world. Whether or not men are conscious of this, the law follows its cycle of completion and establishes a habit as a duly recognized result of the law of the circle in action. Okay, so there's a lot there. Working backwards, he says, whether we know it, whether or not men are conscious of this, the law follows its cycle of completion. So we live with what he calls the law of the circle. We live with this power of the law of the circle, that we can set things into motion, right, that move to completion according to a universal law. So we live with the power of the law of the circle, whether we know it or not, right? So this is one of those moments where I say, well, okay, then given the choice between knowing it or not knowing it, I would prefer to know it. Because if I am wielding great power, I want to use it correctly, right? Because we wield it to great effect, positive or negative, whether or not we mean to. And this law of the circle, right? This law of cycles is always active. And this is why we find that even very simple daily routines are so important, right? We're designed as part of this universe and it cycles. So even those little things that may not seem very important that we do every day, right? Some of that orderliness is actually very key to the health of our life stream and our beings. And we also see that when people become too disordered, regardless of their intention, it becomes completely destructive. And a point can come in life when order is required regardless of the form that it takes, right? And I see this collapsing of this destructiveness as being a loss of that magnetic or gravitational center that we all need, that we're going to talk about a little bit more. So when we create, set in motion, launch into orbit a habit. We're engaging a law. Fumi goes on. Electricity and magnetism play their part in establishing and sustaining the action of habit and the power of habit. Using the example of an electromagnet, I am desirous of imparting to the students an awareness of the circles used in winding wire into a magnetic coil. These are indicative of a repetition of the law of the circle, which circle, in this case, becomes a spiral gathering momentum with each turn, even as a habit is strengthened by its recurrence. The more turns of the wire around the magnetic core, the greater the induction and accompanying magnetism that is created in the electromagnet as the electricity flows through the coil. Okay, so now a more detailed look at the law of the circle. This winding of the coil, winding a wire around a metal core to create an electromagnet. So what's being said here partly is that very specifically that habit is not a linear process with a beginning and an end. It's an ongoing winding that increases in power over time. Now, to fully anchor this idea, we're going to talk a little bit more about electricity and magnetism, which have this very close relationship. It is not very important to, have the understanding of a scientist or an engineer of this, but I believe that this subject actually touches us deeply through our intuition, and we need just enough of it to fire up our intuition, understand how important this concept is. So electricity and magnetism have this close relationship. An electric current can create a magnetic field. A magnetic field can create an electric current. So if you run an electric current through a wire, it creates a magnetic field. Okay. Conversely, if you move a loop of wire, rotate a loop of wire in a magnetic field, the field will induce an electric current in the wire. Okay, so the concept of an electromagnet is that this wire is wrapped around a metal core, and then when you apply current to the wire, it generates a magnetic field. And this is a very useful thing that's all over our world, because unlike a permanent magnet, which always has this attracting and repelling quality, an electromagnet can be controlled by turning the power on and off, or by adjusting the amount of power to adjust the amount of magnetism. Now, the thing that's very interesting that goes back to what Kazumi was saying is that the greater the number of times the coil is wrapped around the core, just a reminder now that we are talking about habit. So the more the core is wound with the wire, the stronger the magnetism. The tighter the wire is wound, right? The more coils that are tightly packed together, the more powerful the magnetism. And the more powerful the current, the more powerful the magnetism. So a habit is like winding a wire. Each repetition of the habit to create an electromagnetic core, which is powered with our life force energy. Right? We are putting our energy into something that generates a magnetic field that has this attractive and potentially repulsive capability. Magnetism. Kathumi's next paragraph is, as we compare the natural laws of physics to the metaphysics of human psychology, we ask the student to pause for a moment to equate for himself this reinforcement of desired or undesired action, as though each act, a thing in itself, gathered unto itself a momentum of energy forming a spiral around the spinal altar, and to consider how this magnetizing of the core of self, one's energy and consciousness, happens each time he mentally or physically goes over, repeats such repetitious cycles, turns of the wire, as he habitually releases his energy, electricity, into the same habit pattern or coil. It will be seen that the power of any habit, good or bad, or a collection of habits, is actually a dominant electromagnetic, if you will, force, a veritable momentum attracting good or evil in both the human and the divine personality of man. Okay, so again, the power of any habit, good or bad, is actually a dominant force, a veritable momentum, attracting good or evil in both the human and the divine personality of man. So this goes a long way towards explaining why habits, why the things that we do and maybe have done for years seem to sort of take on a life of their own. Okay, because there's this action that is like magnetism, that is attracting more to itself, more good, more evil, right? Which can also be more ease or more difficulty, more spontaneous order occurring in your life, more constructive people and activities coming into your life, or more destructive and downward spiraling energies coming into your life. Okay, but then there's also the very mundane aspects, right, of habits. And often when we think about habits, we tend to think sometimes leaning towards bad habits, the really obvious ones being things like addiction, being alcohol and drugs, which, as we're going to see, is not maybe the primary meaning here, but it's still very useful to think about because it's just very easy to our minds to grab onto what it means. So what we're going to look at for a moment is the habit, this thing that now has, as he says, a momentum, right? A dominant electromagnetic force. So it is some kind of whole that now exists on its own versus the individual steps, right? Each individual repetition of a thought, feeling, or action is a wind around the coil. And that individual repetition is where the work occurs, right? So from our perspective here in time and space, where the work occurs is in each individual step we take, right? Whether that is making a good habit, making a bad habit, or unmaking a bad habit, or unfortunately unmaking a good habit. Also possible because our free will is the determining factor in where this all goes. And when looking at habit, we can sometimes miss the trees for the forest, or vice versa, because we can see the totality of a bad habit. We can look at this thing we do and see how it's exerted this power and influence over our lives, maybe for a long period of time, right? And we can be intimidated or overwhelmed by taking it on, right? And that's because we forget that where the work occurs is in each individual line, right? So that in that case, we don't want to keep winding it. We want to make that choice to stop adding to the magnetism of the thing. But even in a good habit, we can sometimes get frustrated because we're thinking in terms of having it established as we work towards it. We can be frustrated that it isn't established. So then we have to remember that where the work occurs, right? If we want to make change, we have to identify the place where change happens. And that's in each individual repetition, right? Or unrepetition, choosing inaction in a case where we know that it's destructive. And hence, that is the most famous saying of the most famous anti-bad habit organization in the world, which is one day at a time. Right? And even if you don't think they've got everything right, it doesn't matter. That piece is right. That's where the action occurs. Okay, but in these teachings, we add to that very real work of one day at a time. Okay, and that has to do with the violet flame. Because once we've identified, now that we know that these habits, right, and in particular now we're looking at the bad ones, have taken on a life of their own and are exerting magnetism and attracting more that supports the reality that this bad habit, this gravitational field that it's generating, now that we know that it's there, we have this tool, which is the violet flame, which can be directed into it, right? Because when we direct the violet flame into a spiritual entity like this, we can direct it into the cause and core, every facet and aspect of it. We can put that in the hands of God. We don't even need to understand every individual step and our reason for every individual step and how we built it up. But we can call in that mercy, that divine assistance to dissolve the thing we have created by setting in motion these celestial laws and transmute that energy. So this is very good, because if we start peeling back the layers, right, of the cause, why we got into this bad habit and how maybe this bad habit is actually a bad habit that's built on this other bad habit, it can get very complicated. And what we want to do is we want to engage with that only enough to get the necessary insight from it, right? We don't want to spend all of our time thinking about our bad habits, because you know what that is? It's a bad habit. So we have to think about it the right amount to call in that violet flame. And then we need that determination and that one day at a time focus to make change occur. Kathumi's next paragraph. These facts are not intended to frighten, but to free by soul illumination all who would take control of their daily lives. However, the average student will require more than the armor of this beginning knowledge to bind the power of old and entrenched habits, unwanted, unfruitful. Like the barren fig tree, these habits, though they lock a great deal of man's energy in a magnetic coil of repetitive desires and deeds, bear no fruit of higher consciousness, much less positive human achievement for social good, which is to be anticipated of every Chela on the path. Therefore, they must be cursed or judged by the Christ, withered by the withdrawal of all energy invested therein, their spirals arrested by a fiat of the will, and their consciousness and momentum cast into the sacred fires of transmutation, invoked steadfastly in dynamic violet flame decrees. I love this use of the gospel story of the barren fig tree, which has perplexed me, and I have wanted a deeper meaning in Jesus Christ cursing, right? That's why he's using that language, cursing and withering the fig tree. Of course, in this context, isn't that beautiful? I mean, do you want to, if you're in the desert, do you want to water a fig tree that bears no fruit? Right? We want to look at the trees of our habits and see if there's fruit on them, and if not, gotta act. Because where we're putting our energy is entirely up to our free will. And then he reminds us that the violet flame decrees are going to be necessary for some of these tough ones that have a lot of tight lines and a history of a lot of energy going into them. There's also an interesting detail in this paragraph. He mentions repetitive desires and deeds, right? And you see, when we think of repetitive desires, we tend to go straight to the deed that the desire generates. But repeating the desire, I think this is where we're being taken into the fact that this subject of habit is quite a bit more subtle than you might realize, right? That repeating the desire, repeating a thought, that this is a habit, and that other habits may be built on top of that. He says, chief among the attributes of divinity, as expressed by an illumined mind, is the power to govern itself. An ungoverned intellect, like unbridled emotion, can result only in disgrace for the erring manifestation. Error cannot affect the pure and holy purposes of universal love, which are in complete unity with the perfect mind of God and cannot be divided by the chicanery of the carnal mind. Ungoverned intellect and unbridled emotion, right? So what these are thoughts and feelings that are not shaped by positive habit. And they will generate manifestations, all of our manifestations, like all of our manifestations, whether they're from positive or negative habit, they will eventually come up against God reality, right? And what he's saying is that the manifestations of these ungoverned qualities will come to disgrace, right? They don't hold up against God reality. The purposes of universal love cannot be divided by the carnal mind. So we don't want to do that, right? We want manifestations that are in harmony. So all of the outer habits we can easily identify are based on these inner habits that are more subtle. Bethumi goes on, the forthright statement of the Christ, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, indicates that ignorance is the first sin upon which the Babylonian tower of error, reaching for the skies, is constructed. If then it be ignorance, which is the first habit to conquer, it can be recognized that by the golden flame of Christ's illumination, the realm of shadow is pushed back. Ignorance is a habit based on sluggishness of mind and an unwillingness to sharpen and use the tool of thought. Lack of knowledge must be countered by joyful seeking after the glory of God, both below among the learnings of men and above in the lofty hills of sacred knowledge and spiritual experience. So this is the place in the teaching where Bethumi actually prescribes a specific habit. Joyful seeking after the glory of God, both below among the learnings of men and above in the lofty hills of sacred knowledge and spiritual experience, right? And this habit is prescribed to shape us inwardly, to shape our thoughts, to shape our emotions, lest we fall into ignorance. And I believe that the reason that this specific prescription is here is because on this good habit, this habit of putting the joyful seeking of God at the forefront of our consciousness, something we practice every day, on this good habit, all other good habits are built. Because without this, how do we know enough truth to develop those positive momentums, right? And truth, I think, is important here because I think the foundation of all of our good habits, the foundation of all of our good habits, at the center of it is something that's true, is a great spiritual truth. And at the other end of that, all negative habits, at the center of them is a lie or ignorance. When we pursue spiritual truth, when we have our practices, when we seek to mold ourselves according to cosmic intent, right, we are embracing that God reality, that we are to become something that we are not yet, that we are to become the Christ, that we are to embody this full communication and manifestation of the I Am presence here on the earth. That's true. So to explore a little bit of the flip side of this, how something that's not true can lead to some other habits, I want to share with you something that came across my perceptions this week, which was this video going around the internet of this fellow who was the co-founder of the Church of Satan. somewhere in South Africa. And he made a 40-minute video explaining to the world, but I think also to his followers and people who knew him, that he was leaving the church that he co-founded because he had become a Christian. And it is a truly remarkable 30 or 40 minutes. And he speaks about how the change in him started when some Christians that he'd met showed him unconditional love. And it wasn't one time when a bunch of Christians did it. No, he had these very, very specific memories of this time this person did it, and this time this other person did it. They didn't judge him for his beliefs or for what he was doing. They just showered him with love, his brother in Christ. But that didn't do it. That wasn't enough to change him. He goes on to describe then how, I mean, he doesn't talk in great detail about it, but how his church of Satan, has these rituals that they perform on a regular basis, and that there's a whole ascending to them, I guess, a series of rituals to gain more power. I would submit that that's probably not actually ascending anywhere, but I think you get what I'm saying. From their perspective, they're doing rituals to gain more power. And then he tells the story of how he's doing one of them, and Jesus Christ comes to him directly. And when he asks him, "How do I know that you are who you say you are?" Jesus showers him with that unconditional love, but at another level. And he recognizes it. But he knows that this is true, this is real, and he's forever changed. Now, the way that this connects to our teaching about habit is that in his talking about how he came to be in the place that he was in, he talks about how the foundation of it was being very broken or very hurt in some way. But the specific thing that is mentioned is saying that he didn't feel worthy of God's love, or had the thought that I'm not worthy of God's love. Well, as I'm in this teaching and in this work this week, I hear him say that, and I think, boy, that's one heck of a habit, right? How much does someone repeat that thought who's really suffering with that idea? And yes, maybe that thought comes from some terrible childhood place that's hard to access, or a past life, right? Maybe it's encoded more deeply than we can imagine or understand, but still, it's the repetition of this falsehood, right, that built this whole world around it. That at the outer layer, what habits do you see him forming? Repeating rituals in the church of Satan. He knew that this was at the core. So that was very striking. But then there was another piece that was very striking that really impacted me. And I will tell you, the whole thing is very moving. I sent it to a friend who wrote back, sent a text, said something like, "I can't stop crying." And I said, "I know, it's impossible not to." But what made a real impact on me is that there was part of it where he's responding to questions or things that he's been emailed, and clearly some of them are asking him to talk about things with his, I don't know, co-founder or other people in the church, or things that he had agreed not to speak about. And he also knew that he was speaking to people who, were probably not excited to hear about Christianity. And the thing that was so remarkable was the total respect that he gave to these people, and his total respect that nothing in him had changed in terms of, he wasn't going to turn around and condemn, what the people that he'd been with yesterday, or condemn the people that he was talking to. And it made his message so powerful because a positive habit that this person had was this habit of giving respect to his brothers and sisters, right? And that's not the same as endorsing everything they do. But I think he was able to recognize it by those people who treated him as their brother in Christ, that they gave him that respect. And so the fact that he was so respectful in what he said made the whole thing very moving. It was very moving to me because I suddenly felt in myself exposed this place where I think there are conditions where I don't have to give my brothers and sisters that complete respect. That I have a negative habit in that place, right? Where this person, was engaged in all sorts of things that I think are incredibly negative, showed me this positive habit. And I wondered, if I was one of those people he met, would I have shown him unconditional love as well if I didn't have that habit of treating everybody with respect? And certainly, I see myself do it and try to correct it or try not to do it. But again, I recognize it as something, oh, wow. Okay, don't fully understand where this came from, but this is something that has some practice and some magnetism to it. And instead of just catching those individual occurrences and trying to undo them, I need to, as Saint Germain says, I need to have a divine plan. I need to decide that this is a thing that's going to change and that I'm going to put something positive and constructive in its place. Right? And all of this, these are all part of our path of self-mastery. Kuthumi says, the law of habit dictates that the one who has created a habit is the only one who can uncreate it, simply because it is his energy, his free will, and his self-creation on the path of self-mastery that are involved. If one does decide to uncreate a habit, then one must adjust the cycles of energy thereby freed so as to divert it into constructive channels. Another important point. Not just using the violet flame to uncreate those habits, but understand that you're going to be releasing some energy. So the work of putting that into the positive habit has to begin right away. And I think where this all leads is that we need to be really excited about self-mastery, right? Because thinking about triumphing over a bad habit, oh my God, I can't eat that anymore or whatever, or thinking about, okay, I need to, do more push-ups or swing the kettlebell, they can all sometimes come with this energy of like, oh, that's going to be rough. But I think what Saint Germain and what Kuthumi want for us is they want us to be excited about self-mastery. While we understand that we need to wind the coil every day and that it's going to be one step at a time, that we need to be looking out ahead at that image of the cosmic man who has overcome these things and be excited to become that man. So in closing, we're going to take this one quote from Kuthumi and then one little piece from Saint Germain from that same dictation that set this all in motion for me, where they're really talking to us about the importance of self-mastery so that we can all walk away today a little spring in our step, a little bit of excitement about how we're going to shape ourselves by cosmic intent. The cause of heaven is served best by making man the master of his own household, his 4 lower bodies, as well as the members of his immediate family, thus enabling him to take his rightful God-intended dominion over the citadels of his domain as ever-widening spirals of good habit responsibility to make him the logical steward of the good on behalf of communities and nations. Now, Saint Germain's take. I tell you, precious ones, when you can command yourself to obey, when you can demonstrate and obtain self-mastery, all these things shall be added unto you. You will not be required to ask us the formula to express the power of divine alchemy. Rather, you will simply speak the word, and the word will obey you. You will have obtained, you will have entered into the blessed state of the ascended master's octave, even before your ascension. So that's what we're working towards. And I think it's important to remember it, and put some wind in our sails, and remind us that the sometimes seemingly mundane work we do to put ourselves in order is part of a grand and glorious path for our souls. Thank you.